Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome back to the Communicate studio for our keynote speech. And I know this is something that everyone's been looking forward to all day, and I know that some of you have joined the conference just for this very exciting speech. One of the benefits of running a virtual conference means that we can open up the doors of Communicate and invite speakers from all over the world. And we're absolutely thrilled that Jeremy Heimans has accepted our invitation to be our keynote speaker at Communicate this year. I don't think Jeremy needs a lot of introduction, but just to give you a bit of a brief, he's co-founder and CEO of Purpose. Headquartered in New York City. There's offices in 6 different countries, including here in the UK. He co-founded GetUp and Avaaz. I know you know about these organizations, but it might be time to go and find out what they're up to these weeks. And most relevant of all, to Communicate, he is the author of New Power. And I know that book and those ideas are inspiring so many of you around the country with your environmental communications campaigns. So Jeremy has agreed to speak on our topic today of New Power, unleashing the power of communities to tackle the ecological and climate crises. He's going to give us some thoughts, and he's promised to leave some time for questions at the end. So get your questions into the stage chat, and I will pose them to Jeremy at the end of his talk. Jeremy, welcome to Communicate. Thank you for joining us.
It's so good to be with you all, and it's wonderful to be with a community of people who are thinking about how to communicate more effectively, right, on these incredibly important planet-defining issues that you're all working on, and that I also work on a lot in my work around the world on climate issues and many others. So it feels like I'm very much among a community of people that are all invested in the same things. And I think that's part of why this conversation, I hope, is an important one, because we are in an environment where the stakes are incredibly high to rally people around the importance of action on climate and other issues like it. And I think this hopefully will be a useful frame for you in your own work around the country. So I'm going to introduce you to this concept of new power. Some of you may already be familiar with it, and then we will sort of open up to a conversation. So what do we mean by new power? How does all of this work? How do we think about it? And to start, much as I hate to mention him, let's talk about Harvey Weinstein. So what kind of power did Harvey Weinstein wield? He was the king of Hollywood for decades, despite being a known abuser. Everybody knew he was an abuser. It was a known fact in Hollywood. Not even the most powerful men in Hollywood who could have protected some of these women ever stood up to him, right? Why? He wielded this form of power as currency, right? The kind of power that the more of it you have, the more powerful you are. He used that power ruthlessly to protect his friends, to punish his enemies, and he became, for a very long time, this person who ruled Hollywood with an iron fist. And you think about that form of power that Harvey wielded, and you compare it to the Me Too movement, right, which is the movement that helped to topple Harvey Weinstein. And think about that as a form of power. It's not the kind of power that Harvey wielded. It's not power as currency, something you can hoard up and spend. It's really power that works more like a current, like a surge of energy that gets more powerful the more people have it, the more people exercise it, right? It's something that is shared, it's open, and as the Me Too movement emerged, it sort of changed and adapted to each new industry and geography that it traveled, and many leaders, right, emerged to do that work rather than one leader atop a big hierarchy. The next story is something that we're all living through now, right? We are living through this very curious moment where we're in the biggest public health crisis of our lives, and we have this conflict between the public health establishment and the people who are spreading wittingly and unwittingly vaccine misinformation, right? We actually wrote about this in the British Medical Journal the year before COVID, where we said, the danger of anti-vaxxers and their new power tools, right? Their ability to spread their messages in these communities, person to person, very powerfully. They don't have the resources, the infrastructure, or the numbers that the rest of us do, or that governments and public health institutions do, and yet they're doing a lot right now to undermine the public health response to this crisis. And so we see the stakes of what a small number of people can do, right, to undermine institutions and experts. That is also true of the climate fight, right, where climate deniers have undermined and made the issue of climate change much more divisive than it would have been or could have been. So thinking about that contrast. And similarly, this story is a pretty sobering story of a young woman from Glasgow called Aksa Mahmoud. Normal kid, grew up loving Harry Potter. One day at age 17, she disappears. And a few days later, her distraught parents get a call from her. She'd gone all the way from the bus station in Glasgow to Syria to join the Islamic State. She'd been radicalized in her bedroom, and then she became this very effective recruiter for ISIS. She built this network of girls, this kind of girl-to-girl network. We studied her methods. You know, it was so kind of intimate, and she turned this ideology of frankly, oppression of women and medieval theocracy into something that was appealing to other lost girls from Western countries, many of whom then went to join her in Syria. So you contrast her techniques with the way the big institutions that faced the threat of ISIS initially responded, right? The first thing they did was they got some fighter jets and they started just raining down leaflets on the civilian populations of Iraq and Syria, telling them not to join ISIS. You know, you contrast that to the kind of peer-to-peer metastasizing communications methods of Aksa Mahmoud and ISIS. There was no match for that. So when they realized that they needed to embrace social media, they created this Twitter account that is, again, very revealing in its kind of willful ignorance, right? Where you're creating a Twitter account designed to dissuade potential jihadists, think again, turn away, addressed to potential jihadists. If you're just on the verge of joining ISIS, the US State Department's probably not the most effective messenger, right? So these three stories, the schoolgirl who outmaneuvers the State Department, this sort of epic battle going on right now between misinformation spread by these communities of online anti-vaxxers and the public health establishment, and this titan of Hollywood who is toppled by this very different kind of movement. These are all examples of what we think of as the difference between old power and new power. Again, old power, that power is currency. New power, power that works like a current, made by many, uploads, shares, it's open. Old power tends to be held by a few. It's based on what you know, what you own, what you control, that others do not. So think of these as two methods and mindsets for exercising power. And they're both methods and mindsets that you need to master in order to do work in the world that we're all going to need to master in order to win the current fight over motivating the world to take action on climate. Here's another way to think about the difference between old and new power. This is Tetris, the most popular video game of the 20th century. We all remember Tetris. It's a block-based game. The blocks are falling on your head. They get faster and faster. You've got to form them into neat rows until they eventually overwhelm you. So it's a single-player game, you versus the system. Ultimately, the system always wins in Tetris. You're very constrained in your agency. It's a great metaphor for old power, right? Contrast that with Minecraft, which is the most popular video game of the 21st century, also block-based. But everything in Minecraft is built from the bottom up by its users, block by block, right? There's no rules really constraining you in Minecraft. It's kind of a world of imagination. It's a world of constructing whole worlds, real and imagined, right? And that is a very exciting world for a lot of young people, right? The thing about Minecraft that's very different to Tetris is it's a multiplayer game. And the way that you create things and make things happen in Minecraft is through collaborating with other users. And that really brings us to this this contrast, this battle and balance between what we call old power values and new power values. Think about being a kid today growing up in a Minecraft world rather than a Tetris world, right? Most of us grew up in a Tetris world. This Minecraft world, how is that going to make your attitudes toward institutions different? How is that going to shape your view of what you get to do in the world, how you get to participate, your norms around collaboration, participation? They're all going to be very different, right? And that's really what this is about. And at this moment, I should stop and make a really important point, which is that our argument in this work is not new power good, old power bad, right? Because the reality is that these models and methods and mindsets can be used in very good and very bad ways on both sides, right? Like in the course of this COVID crisis, right, we've seen the incredible need for experts. Experts got us a vaccine in record time, right? For example, the kind of rigor and the rigor and structure of scientific inquiry, and frankly, we've needed our public institutions in this era in many ways. And so our argument is not one's good and one's bad, but rather that you need to understand both of these mindsets, this set of values, right? This contrast we see, and we think about this in many of the movements that we're involved in, right? Between the formal representative governance that dominated in the 20th century. You think about even an institution like Amnesty International, right? Very formal governance, very democratic, right? A very representative governance, but in some ways you could argue more inclusive as a form of governance, but like also really hard to, really unwieldy and really inefficient in lots of ways, right? And so that informal network governance that we see, this dynamic between competition and collaboration, this dynamic between a belief in transparency as an end in itself and the separation between the public and private, and these norms that frankly many of us grew up with, were quite different. And as I mentioned on experts, right, if we're thinking about expertise, think about climate scientists, right? Think about many of the organizations you represent and the expertise that they have about the environment, about nature. And, we live in this context where experts, we need them more than ever. But if they are not, able to advocate around their own ideas, they often end up getting eclipsed by people who actually don't really value that expertise. So that's a big dynamic. And finally, affiliation and loyalty, right? One of the dynamics of our age is that people tend to be less loyal and permanent in their affiliation to institutions. It doesn't mean that they're affiliating less. Arguably, they're affiliating more. They're joining, they're liking, they're popping in and out of things. But if you're an organization, doing the kind of work that many of the organizations in this group represent, you got to understand that those models of affiliation are changing. You can't rely on people to be card-carrying paid members of your organization for 40 years, right? And that requires different engagement models, new ways of reaching people. So what we did in our work on this, when we first sort of launched it into the world, was built this framework we called the New Power Compass, which tries to plot organizations on this framework, right? Where on the horizontal axis, we have values, old and new power. Do the values of the organization map more to that left-hand column or that right-hand column that I just showed you? And on the vertical axis, we have models, right? Is the model, the core operating model, like if you like the business model of the organization, more reliant on Tetris dynamics or Minecraft dynamics? Is it more reliant on top-down exclusivity, capture, control, or is it more reliant on upload, participation, etc.? So let's take a very quick tour of this compass. We think about the castles quadrant in that bottom left, right? These are the models that most of our social institutions are still built on. Most of these organizations, these are the organizations that thrived in the 20th century. I think an interesting outlier might be Apple, right? Apple is a tech company. So you might ask, well, why is a tech company old power? And I think one important insight here is that, technology does not equal new power. You can still use technology in very old power ways. And if you think about Apple, Apple's business model is really, some product designer in California knows what we need before we know we need it. I think right now the new iPhone is being launched. Whatever the new features are, we're all going to go and probably buy it, right? Whether or not we need it. And it's a secretive company. It's not a collaborative company. And yet it's still the most valuable company in the world. So you can still have some successful strategies in that Castles quadrant, but most can't be Apple. And then you think about the Cheerleaders Quadrant. These are fundamentally still old power models, but they're in some sort of evolution, right? They're shifting. Think about The Guardian. The Guardian's still a newspaper. It has journalists who write things, we read them, it's very download. On the other hand, The Guardian, reframed its concept of a subscriber to a member. And the aspiration, I'm not sure they've fully realized this, but the aspiration behind a membership is that we are now all, as members of The Guardian, invested in the mission of the newspaper. We maybe participate now in the research. They're crowdsourcing some of the research for some of their investigative journalism. They ask people to take action on issues like climate change, where the values of the newspaper are represented. So it's a model in transition. That's what the cheerleaders represent. The top right are the crowds. The crowds quadrant, model, kind of, there's two archetypes, right? So in the top right, you've got, movements like Black Lives Matter. I think the important thing to note about these sorts of movements, also true of Extinction Rebellion, these are not institutions at all, right? You cannot knock on the door of Black Lives Matter and say, I want to speak to the head of Black Lives Matter, because there are many leaders and it's not a formal organization. So one of the key skills, I think, especially as we think about climate and building a kind of successful movement there, many of you represent, what I would describe as probably more old power organizations, right? Doing critical work, right, in the space, right, around the environment, around natural history, conservation, etc., with very important expertise that you represent, right? However, how do these more traditional institutions form alliances with the social movements that are frankly more chaotic, that have many leaders, that are evolving, but that represent enormous energy? And it's going to often be that combination of the energy of the new power movements and the expertise and legitimacy of the old power organizations that's going to get us there. The problem is that a lot of old power organizations are afraid of these new movements and don't know how to engage with them, right? So this is a key kind of capability that I think many of you will need over the next years to really hone, right? And then on the top left, you've got the co-opter quadrant. Co-opters are in many ways the most interesting, the most dangerous quadrant in the world today, because these are the models that have thrived on new power. Think about a Facebook, right? Billions of us participating, uploading, sharing across their various networks, Instagram, etc. We're all sharing every day, and yet we have no insight into the algorithm that is shaping our opinions and our feelings every day. We have no share in the economic value they created. We have no say in the governance. So really what Facebook has done is they've used the network effects of new power to get to scale, and then they've locked down in a very old power way and consolidated their own power. This model is, I think we're going to see a lot more of, and it's very dangerous, right, for the world. And it is part of the backdrop for, I think, a lot of the challenges we're having around polarization and conflict that is getting in the way of progress on a number of issues that we all collectively care about. So I kind of a piece of homework for you. I would love to hear from you and to have you think about, where do you think your organization fits on this framework? And where do you think it should be in 5 years? And that's a very interesting exercise to do at home with your own teams, to really think through, okay, where do we want to go, right? We might be a castle now, but do we want to be a crowd, or do we just want to be a cheerleader? The goal, to be clear, is not for everybody to be in the top right, because not everybody should be that, right? That's a particular function in an ecosystem. But thinking about where you want to fit within the ecosystem is a really key question. So I'd encourage you all to do that at home. So just a few concluding thoughts, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So I think one is, the future really is going to be a battle over mobilization, right? We all live this, right? You live this in your work. So a lot of the work, and you guys are the communications professionals, many of you, so you understand this better than most. You may understand this better than the technocrats and the experts and the scientists on your teams. How do we make the case that we are going to need to mobilize people more effectively? It's not enough to be right, and that I think is a big gap, especially when you're facing an opposition who are prepared to say or do anything, including just make stuff up, right? That's a very unconstrained. It makes their advocacy easier than ours is, right? So that's, again, I think why this work is so important. We've been doing this on climate in many, many parts of the world. So Purpose, the organization I run, is a team, about 200 people around the world. We run campaigns, we communicate on many issues. We have about 40 people working dedicated on climate change around the world, and many, many more who work with us. In Poland, for example, we have been doing some fascinating work that is about, really trying to figure out how do you mobilize. Problem with so much climate communications is it's obviously, as we all know, reaching people who already are convinced. So in Poland, which is a blocker country in many ways on climate internationally, we realized, well, we've got to move conservatives, and the best way to move conservatives in the Polish context is to move Catholics. So we helped to build a kind of Polish Catholic climate movement. And as we thought about what that looked like, we realized it really needed to be framed in the scriptures of John Paul II, right? Because that's the Pope that the Poles are clearly the most invested in. And so we ran this kind of huge initiative all over the world, but also in the lead up to COP being hosted by Poland a few years ago, and created this kind of national Catholic climate movement in Poland, which has now continued to really, I think, reframe that issue, right, for a very different audience, right, in ways that actually made sense to a much more conservative, much more skeptical group. So as we'll think about how to use new power in these ways, I think the critical thing as well is to get past our comfort zone and to try to reach new audiences on these issues. I think an important dynamic of our age today is that intensity is often more important than favorability. What do I mean by this? This is very true on climate, right, and on ecological issues, is the people who are, for whatever reason, opposed to action on climate have so much intensity about it, right? And we need to find ways of making climate as human and as urgent, right, as the opponents of action on climate have made it, right? Not dry, not technical, and you guys know this well, but that sometimes means you have to make some people unhappy. You have to court some degree of controversy. You cannot, you cannot deliver messages that are so bland that everybody agrees with them, but nobody cares about them. And so thinking about the kind of intensity of your messaging for particular audiences, I think is really important. And I alluded to this earlier, but I think the most effective actors now are really blending old and new power together, right? I think that's what's going to be key on many issues. In the US, Purpose has worked a lot on the issue of gun violence, and we were up against the NRA, right? One of the most powerful organizations in America who represent this kind of rabid gun movement. And so we built a new movement that now has, I think, 10 million members in the US, which is all about a different way of looking at the gun issue, the gun violence epidemic, but we totally had to reframe the issue. And we had to combine a big old power infrastructure with might that could do lobbying, that could sort of that could scare politicians the way the NRA does, and say, listen, we're gonna only back you if you support more progressive gun laws, but also a movement. And that combination, which is what the NRA has, of a big grassroots movement and the kind of old power kind of authority, expertise, brand, that's going to be needed. In the climate movement, I think we need to move beyond just the existing groups, and we need to find really new alliances of the kind that I described in Poland. In India, our work on climate has been very focused on the health sector, allying with them and reframing climate as a public health issue. is what makes sense in that context, right? But these alliances between new and old power, between the energy of those movements and the authority and expertise of the old power organizations, I think are where a lot of the action is going to be. We've been doing this recently on COVID. We formed a very unusual partnership with the United Nations, and we've created a communications infrastructure to fight misinformation, where we take their science of the WHO and the UN agencies, but turn it into content that actually travels peer-to-peer and that inspires people. And that work of bridging the science, the expertise, and the content that travels the same way misinformation does, but making that content fact-based, has really been effective in ways that even surprised us in reaching new audiences and vulnerable audiences who are susceptible to misinformation. So, this is the work you're doing every day, trying to use new power to help the least powerful. And that, of course, those are the people who are most going to be impacted by ecological devastation. So I want to thank you for your work and appreciate that work, and very excited to take some questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jeremy. And we've already got people saying in the chat that they are up for the challenge of placing themselves on that quadrant. And I wonder if there's an addition to your homework of saying, where's your organization now? Where does your organization think it is? And actually, where is it going? Because I think there might be some differences of opinion within some of the organizations as well. So we've got a whole set of questions, but I think the first ones that came through are really around those alliances and partnerships that you were talking about. We've had one question saying, what are some of the best cross-quadrant alliances? Is it between the crowds and the cheerleaders? How can we do that effectively? And another saying, how do we support people working in old power structures who want to reach out and make some of those strong alliances?
It's a great question. I love that question of the quadrant alliances. I haven't heard that one before, and I've been asked many questions on this. I think there's a few different configurations. Speaking frankly on our COVID work, we have found that alliances with the co-opters are necessary, even if slightly undesirable, right? In the sense that, like, the platforms like Facebook, are a huge part of the problem of how misinformation is spreading. But we can't ignore them, because if we ignore them, it's only going to be worse. So we've formed a lot of alliances in that work with the big platforms to get them to give algorithmic priority to the right information, and to make sure that we find content that's going to work. One example of that, which I think is applicable as well to climate, is we built this model called Team Halo. And we recruited scientists from all the labs around the world developing COVID vaccines and trained them in how to use TikTok and become these really human, really compelling, really entertaining narrators of what COVID vaccines are, and answering people's questions and alleviating their fears. And it's worked incredibly well. And because that content, performs well in the vernacular of a platform like TikTok, it actually really flies. And then if you get the platforms to give that content priority in the algorithm, you can really compete with that misinformation that is spreading. And that's certainly what we're finding with the Team Halo content. So I think, we have to work with them, but we also have to hold them accountable, right? And so that's an interesting kind of alliance that we've had to form.
Great. Our next question comes from someone who I know works in communications for the Government Department for the Environment here in the UK. And he's asked, is it possible for government and government organizations, in your view, to operate in quadrants other than the castles?
Yeah, I think absolutely. At Purpose, we do quite a bit of work with both governments and multilateral organizations where we have shared objectives. And I think, yes, I think governments, already are using very new power tactics, sometimes in nefarious ways, right? Like, you could argue that the Russian government is old power at home, new power abroad, right? In the tactics that they're using to manipulate social media in other places. So clearly it is governments are mastering some of these tools, right? And they can master them in positive ways too. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the best examples of governments using these tools are actually quite coercive, right? But there's no reason why they can't also be very positive exemplars, right, in the right context. So yes, I think that's possible. And yes, I think governments can form alliances with social movements, right? If you're trying to get, you know, a criminal justice bill in the US passed that is about, limiting the power of police to abuse people of color, you have to partner and be in alliance with the Black Lives Matter movement and all of the movements that represent that cause. There's going to be great power in that sort of strategic alliance building.
Here's a question from Melissa. She said, this might be a chicken and egg question, but in order to start a movement, do you start with the message you want to spread or the audience you want to reach?
It's a good question. I mean, I think it really depends on what the movement is. I mean, I think you obviously need to know, I think a distinction that is useful when you're thinking about a campaign or a movement early on is, are you looking to achieve a very specific goal initially, or are you trying to increase the salience of the issue, right? So in other words, like if you are trying to get a particular piece of legislation passed or blocked by X date, that probably requires a very different set of strategies than, okay, we need to increase the salience of the issue of climate change for these audiences. And if we do that, then we think a certain window is going to open policy-wise for a set of new ideas, right? That's very different because you need more new power typically to increase the salience of an issue. You need more old power typically if you're trying to get a very specific outcome achieved in a short-term context, like I need to get this bill passed. Because if you need to get the bill passed, you're going to need some new power, but you're also going to need to be like lobbying, in Westminster and doing a set of things like that, right? So that's an important frame to understand, like, are you doing large-scale movement building, salience raising work, or are you trying to get something very, very narrow and specific done in the short term?
I think our next one is maybe more of a comment to share, but I'm going to phrase it as a question because I think it's interesting. And it's from Emma, who is doing a lot of movement building here in the UK, and she's worried that we're making environmental issues political and that we're making them kind of associated to being liberal or left-leaning. And I don't know if you have a comment on that or if you agree with that.
I do. I mean, I think it's a real challenge, right? I mean, and so there's a real complexity there, and I think I addressed that a moment ago. A lot of the work that Purpose is doing on climate is trying to reach audiences that are not just classic left liberal audiences, because we know that's not enough to win, right? We just know it, right? We've seen it, or in a place like India, there just aren't enough people with a traditional left liberal frame on the environmental issues for that to be compelling. It's just not going to work, and so absolutely. I think the challenge is that the answer is not then to make everything really bland, which is the point I was making about intensity and favorability. If you run campaigns that are just that just try to take the sting out of it altogether and it just becomes really soft, that probably won't work either. So I think it's actually about having multiple strategies in the field at the same time that may be very different for different audiences, right? So, we do need the Extinction Rebellions. We need movements that are creating urgency and a sense of crisis and that frankly are more appealing to that base of people. We also need strategies that are appealing and palatable to conservatives, to religious folks, to business interests. And we have to have all of those things operating in an ecosystem. And ideally, bits of the ecosystem need to be talking to each other to actually coordinate on strategy, so that when big moments happen like the COPs, et cetera, that we're all singing from a useful, where it's useful, that there's commonality of messaging. So often what's missing is, the two things I think generally are missing is usually a lot of left liberal strategies and not a lot of other strategies. And then the second piece that's missing is that no one talks to each other to coordinate effectively. Or if they do, they're in really lumbering coalitions that kind of drag everything down to this kind of lowest common denominator blandness, and then they get ignored, right? So there's this complex ecosystem level work that is a lot of our work at Purpose, you know, the work of our climate lab, where we're trying to bring together all these unlikely actors, right? You know, business, health sector, educators, and the environmental movement, civil society activists in these configurations that can actually break through and get those people to engage with each other in shared strategic work. That's also a lot of the work we do with our clients, right? When we have clients and work with them is helping them reach beyond, right, their comfort zones and their usual repertoires.
I think that leads really well into this question from Nikki, who I think summarizes where a lot of organizations are at. She's asking, how do we retain the things that are of value for us from old power, our expertise, our long-term supporters, without, sorry, Nikki, I'm reading this badly. How can we retain the things that are of value from old power whilst using new power tools and strategies without alienating our long-term supporters?
It's a great question. I mean, I think, and that's a lot of the work that is involved in this transition for many organizations, at least from that kind of castle quadrant to the cheerleader quadrant. I think the answer is that, like, you know, they're not mutually exclusive, right? That even your long-term supporters want to feel more engaged. They don't want to just be writing you a check once a month passively, but they want to kind of feel more ownership, right, of their involvement with the organization. Point one. I think point two, you don't necessarily bring change into old power organizations right away in the belly of the beast. You find ways to experiment out, you know, on the margins. You find ways to bring new ideas in that can be transformative, right? But that you start by doing it in a safe place, right, that doesn't create too much disequilibrium within the core organization. So that's a lot of what we talk about in our book, right? Is like, how do you do it? Like, what are some models to make that change? Who are the archetypes you need within an organization to kind of lead that kind of change? And it can be done.
And what do you see organizations or groups getting wrong most often? You know, examples where maybe they're taking the tools or reading the book, or, you know, engaging with you all and then heading off on their journey, and you think, oh no, not that way. Be careful. Have you got any examples?
Absolutely. I mean, I think I love the story we tell in the book that does make the English look a little silly, which I'm just going to own, but maybe as an Australian by origin, that's why I enjoy it so much, is the Mcboatface story, right? This is an institution that tries to involve the crowd in this very shallow way, you know, in the naming of this ship by the National Environmental Research Council in the UK. Mm. The crowd kind of has fun with it, decides that this ship should be called Boating with Boatface. They were not ready for that. They kind of refused to do it. They ignored the crowd, and it remains this kind of fascinating missed opportunity because, you know, I think that had they gone with the crowd in that case, they probably would have gotten so much more engagement with their work, because this was kind of such a famous moment that captured a sense of fun and people's imagination. But it was also an example of an old power organization that didn't think in a robust way about how you do this work, right? There wasn't a strategy behind it. They didn't have legitimacy with their audience going in. They didn't really have a willingness to let go of control or anticipate outcomes that they weren't happy with. And they weren't committed to doing the work over and over again. This is not work you do as a stunt. It's not like a fun thing you do. It's a muscle that you have to develop.
I think that's a really great analogy. Interesting question here from Mel, who's asking about when movements become exclusive or turn into kind of them and us, and she's used veganism as an example. I'm wondering how we can make movements accessible again and, you know, kind of give them back to the crowd.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, I think a lot of this is about how what you might think of as an in-group and an out-group are defined, right, in a movement and in society, right? So you think about what Donald Trump did. Donald Trump said the in-group is old white guys, like, you know, who are afraid of losing their status in the society, and everyone who's not a white man basically is in the out-group, right? So I think a lot of, and so you're not really an American if you're not like a kind of white guy. That was really the subtext of a lot of the Donald Trump message. And so I think a lot of the work we need to do in general, and to create less polarization, is to expand the us, right? And to create more inclusive definitions of us in many of the things that we're doing, right? And many of the movements. But that has to be convincing. People have to see why, oh, okay, I see what I share in common with, with someone who's very different to me. And that's, I think, quite relevant to the environmental movement, because we're actually all in it together. The common enemy is like going to hit all of us. And so how do we create that? Some interesting academic research has been done. Like, if there was an alien invasion, everybody would be like, oh, wow, I don't really care if, you're black or white or, gay or straight or whatever. Like, we're all in this common definition of human. The us would expand to be the human race, up against the aliens. But but effectively, climate change is like an alien invasion. It's this huge force that, like, we all have a collective interest in stopping, right? But we can't quite think that way. So what are the ways that we can shift some of our thinking? And I think that's some of the work that's ahead.
Great. And I think one more big question, which is of interest to a lot of people here, this has come from Tim, who's been involved with Communicate since the beginning, asking again about the role of expertise. And I know that you touched on this early on. We've got a lot of expertise in this virtual room in terms of conservation and research and so much environmental knowledge. Just how we can best reframe that, rechannel it, really use it as we embrace new power.
Well, look, firstly, we need that expertise, right? And in the same way that with the COVID crisis, we've rediscovered the value of experts in some ways, right? So I think, like, don't throw that out. The recommendation here is not like abandon your experts and just build crowds and hope for the best. But I think it's about that model, like I described with Team Halo, of helping experts be new power ambassadors, right? Like, we took these scientists and we trained them in how to use this kind of totally new set of tools. And I'd encourage you to go to TikTok, and it's all over the internet, but go to TikTok and look at the hashtag Team Halo, and you'll find all of these experts doing a wonderful, very human job, kind of demystifying COVID and COVID vaccines. So I think that there are models that can turn these experts into new power champions. And that's what I would encourage you all to explore, and, happy to engage with you all at purpose in ways to help you do that.
Okay, brilliant. Well, we're just about out of time, but the one question I've been asking all of our guests coming into the studio today was, can you leave us with a provocation or a challenge? We've got one more day of the conference tomorrow, and then it's back to the day job on Thursday. So is there something you can leave us to kind of get us thinking and making the most of tomorrow?
Well, look, I mean, I think it would be this question of, like, how do you use your experts to reach beyond the already convinced, and the provocation of, like, getting out of our comfort zones and really trying to find creative ways to reach the audiences that we know will be necessary to win, and parking for a little bit our own indignation at the people who need to be convinced, our own indignation about the people who don't understand the facts, and actually recognizing that if we hold that indignation, we're going to lose this very important fight, right? So, but again, I'm so happy to be able to talk to this group and look forward to your reactions and how you use these ideas in the weeks ahead.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for making the time to join us today. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, for all of your questions and comments. Let's keep the discussion going. Tomorrow, we can send Jeremy a note with some of the thoughts and provocations that have come out of today's session. That's all for our conference today. I hope you have a safe travel home to wherever you're going, and we'll look forward to seeing you at 9 a.m. tomorrow for day 2 of Communicate.